Okay. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Sam Hammond. He's a senior economist at the Foundation for American Innovation and writes a Substack at secondbest.ca. My favorite thing about Sam's writing is his intellectual breadth. He can write about Hegel and Mormonism and economics, but also has a deeply technical understanding of the latest breakthroughs in AI. Sam, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Dan.
First question on your intellectual influences. You've tweeted, all my work consists of a series of footnotes to Joseph Heath. Which of his ideas has most influenced you?
Well, Joseph Heath he's well known in Canada, but I think he's the department chair of philosophy at University of Toronto. The first book I ran into in high school was his Rebel Cell, which is a book all about the counterculture, 60s counterculture, and with Andrew Potter. And the premise of the book is that the 60s counterculture was a kind of betrayal of sort of good social democratic left values, and the basic tactics and strategies of the counterculture were self-reinforcing. So, the counterculture had this theory of mass consumer society, and the way to push back against that is to rebel. And he walked through a series of very compelling examples that rebellion, that sort of attempt to subvert the culture, is actually the fuel of cultural change. And what we think of as mainstream is just things that were once renegade becoming popular. And this sort of quest for status and status distinction, or through consumption, conspicuous consumption, is like this never-ending thing that just drives the consumer cycle. And so, in your attempt to rebel, you're actually feeding into capitalism. And it was this great sort of application of like rational choice theory and like prisoner dilemma style reasoning to culture, and it got me very interested in the topic. Heath, more broadly, he's sort of a student of Charles Taylor, the great Canadian philosopher. And I have a book on my shelf over here called Canadian Idealism, which is all about the sort of influence of German idealism on Canadian philosophy. And you can think of Charles Taylor, Joseph Heath, C.B. Macpherson, Marshall McLuhan, George Grant. These folks are sort of working in that tradition, fleshing out a version of kind of a sort of Canadianized version of German idealism, which in America manifested as American pragmatism. So they're very closely related.
So Heath has an article where he praises Iain Banks' culture series. And one of the big ideas that he pulls on is that the series imagines a future transformed first by the evolution of culture and by technology only secondarily. Do you think culture or technology will be the primary force shaping our future?
Well, technology will be the thing shaping our future. The big upshot of that piece was, in my mind, this idea that culture can become defunctionalized. And I've sort of turned that into a motto that the problem isn't that our culture is dysfunctional, it's that it's defunctional. And that showed up in my academic work. I did my master's thesis on secularization and trends in U.S. secularization from the perspective of religion as a club good, as a kind of provider of social insurance. And as the welfare state expanded, you sort of crowd out the functional need to have strong religious dogmas as sort of a filtering mechanism for commitment and to ward out free riders. And so that's sort of an example in micro of how the rise of modern bureaucratic welfare states sort of leads to that defunctionalization of culture, including religious culture. And what Heath is drawing from the culture series is, playing that out forward. What happens when we have sort of superabundance and we're in a post-AGI world where we have basically everything we want? Well, culture at that point just becomes purely memetic. There's absolutely no functional basis to it. And for that reason, it ends up being drawn into a kind of basin of attraction, which is a culture that only exists to replicate itself. And I think there are some, kind of ominous parallels between that vision and kind of American culture in some ways, or sort of post-Protestant culture, where we've been drawn into a kind of soft power kind of culture that sort of spreads very memetically around the world. I think it was striking during the George Floyd protests that there were similar protests in Sweden and Japan and all around the world, all for different sort of things, all sort of piggybacking off sort of American culture motifs. And so it seems to be true that the kind of culture that we've stumbled into is very memetic. It sort of exists to replicate itself. and it's hard to see a way out of that other than through some kind of major technological change. But if you're following the logic of defunctionalization, then what most of what the kind of change that we're looking forward to with AI is just going to accelerate those trends, because it's going to remove the need to have sort of functionalized cultures. We will have abundance at our fingertips, and so the need to have social norms for coordination kind of withers away.
Do you think that if you're a policymaker in today's world and you want to get your ideas to spread, should you be more conscious about trying to make sure it has memetic qualities?
Maybe the word there that I would hesitate with is being more conscious about it, right? Like, was Donald Trump in 2016 very conscious of his memetic qualities, or was he memetic for the very fact that he wasn't self-aware about it? There's sort of this it only works if you don't think about it kind of quality, where Ron DeSantis has some folks on his communication team that were trying to create Trump-like memes, and it just didn't work because it was a little too self-aware, a little too metacognitive of what they were doing. And so I think you got to let the memes flow through you. You can't direct the meme.
Got it. What are Alexander Kojev and Francis Fukuyama missing in their interpretations of Hegel?
Well, I think where Kojev goes the most wrong is just this idea of Hegel as like having a strong teleology to history. This sort of vision of, obviously Hegel inaugurates a kind of historicist project that understands history as having a progression, and once you've accepted that, then you can easily be led into thinking, well, what's it progressing to, and can we figure that out? Maybe we can accelerate that progression. But Hegel pretty clearly says that this idea that we can sort of see the future and have these like rational projects is just a purely armchair philosophical thing. And his famous line is, "The owl Minerva flies at dusk." Like, the whole point is that the future is radically contingent, and it's only in retrospect that we sort of retcon history into having this structure of necessity. So I think that's just been a broader misreading of Hegel, that he has a sort of strong sort of Marxist kind of teleology. I think people later on read that into him, but both the sort of end of history kind of version and the Karl Popper kind of attack on Hegel, I think, really tainted his ideas for Western philosophy.
What of your ideas are most Hegelian?
That reason is situated, that it's embedded in social interaction, that individuals by themselves are not rational. We're rational in groups. That there is a sense in which the rational is actual. That if institutions exist and persist in nature, then we can try to reconstruct why they exist. There must be some reason, and this idea that because norms are sort of instituted, the philosophical term would be recognitively. I recognize the norms and you recognize the norms, and that creates the norm. That we don't need a God's eye view for morality, that morality is kind of a given. There's sort of a continuum between social custom, like etiquette, all the way up to, strong morality about murder and violence and stuff like that. It's all sort of conventional in a certain sense. But because we live in that convention, we inherently are committed to those conventions, and our only source for critiquing those conventions isn't some like skyhook that we can pull from like the cosmic morality written in the stars, but we have to sort of work from within those inherited presuppositions, inherited norms and customs, by finding where they conflict or where there's inconsistencies, and through that dialectic, sort of pulling our norms into a greater state of rationalization.
Do you think in some ways libertarians undergone a dialectic with the move to state capacity libertarianism, and a little bit less of the movement feels a bit different than it did in like the 2000s and 2010s?
That's a good question. I think everything is always in flux, right? There's some family resemblance between sort of Hegelian thinking and like process ontologies and stuff like that. So like everything is becoming, in a sense, and so like nothing is static. Everything sort of is sort of fit for purpose and fit for its time. The same way that like supply siderism and the sort of infatuation of tax cuts sort of, was in the right place at the right time, is when when taxes were very, very high at the top marginal rates. And I think now we're seeing the ways in which a incapacitated state is not conducive to liberty. It's conducive to all kind of dysfunction, which then has to have more state involvement to offset and compensate for that dysfunction. So I think we're always sort of fitting our ideologies to the problems of the day. So that's not totally surprising. I don't know if it's been truly like a classical sort of dialectical process, but the way I would frame it as a dialectic would be to say, and it's sort of implicit in some of my papers. This paper, The Free Market Welfare State, that is in a sense trying to reconcile big welfare states and the existence of big welfare states with a more free market orientation to economic to regulation, and to show how those can be reconciled. And so I think there is a sort of similar effort to try to reconcile concepts of state effectiveness and having a strong government with senses of or with ideas around liberty and non-interference. I don't know how. I think we're still in that process, because I can see a version of libertarianism that's sort of more rooted in a kind of civic republican idea of non-domination rather than non-interference, rather than the rule being that the state should just not interfere in our lives. It's really about understanding the state as a social contract that what really matters is that no one view of the good life be dominating the other. And that's actually quite consistent with a view of a need for state capacity, where state capacity is very closely synonymous with rule of law, right? Places with weak state capacity often, things get done through bribery, through knowing the person because they're your cousin or something like that. And that introduces all kinds of room for discretion. And, coming out of the 2016 election, I remember some of my libertarian friends, one of the first things Trump did was give Carrier, the manufacturer, a huge tax cut to relocate to Ohio. And, I had a lot of friends that were trying to justify that, saying, oh, this is like a reduction in theft. Taxation is theft, and they're just reducing theft. But it's reducing theft for one particular company in the form of a special favor. And that's not rule of law. And if we let stuff like that sort of accumulate, then we lead to sort of a disintegration of rule of law and end up in a worse place. And so you can sort of see also here this interesting connection between kind of Hegelian ideas and Hayekian ideas. And I sort of backed myself into Hegel via Hayek. I was more of a Hayek person, but a lot of what Hayek is doing is sort of translating social epistemology and cultural evolution to a Western analytical philosophy kind of audience. And even in his later books, he starts borrowing these like Hegelian terms like rational reconstruction and stuff like that. So I think there's sort of a libertarian state capacity version of Hegel hiding in Hayek.
All right. I've seen a lot of this idea that effective altruism is a sort of Protestant integralism. You may have tweeted this. I actually couldn't find the quote, but I wrote it down a little while ago. Effective altruism is a sort of Protestant integralism stripped of its explicit religious coding. My question is, would movements like effective altruism actually benefit from just becoming more explicitly religious, even if they acknowledge themselves as secular? So thinking of something like Auguste Comte's Religion of Humanity.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that the term, the Comte actually coined the term altruism as an explicit form of his Religion of Humanity was an explicitly sort of post-Christian let's get rid of the superstition and keep all the good parts philosophy. And his Religion of Humanity was very similar to EA, where they had meetups and people were extolled to write in the mainstream press, like the New York Times op-ed pages of the day, to talk about benefiting all of humanity. Yeah, I think I would start by saying what is a religion. One way to see what a religion is that prior to the Enlightenment, the social world we structured our social world and our obligations through a symbolic order, right? There's a sense in which even if you go back far enough, a sense in which even natural phenomena like weather were punishments by the gods. So, what is a religion? Religion's structure our social obligations and structure like our sense of the symbolic world. And if you think about what the Enlightenment did was it sort of led to this rationalization process where our sense of our standards for validity in the realm of like truth and empiricism began to detach from our standards of validity in the realm of imperatives and right and wrong. And so that's gives rise to like the naturalistic fallacy. That's something that is really only cognizable post Enlightenment. And so one of the ways you can interpret the Enlightenment is like this awareness of the genealogy of our morals, as Nietzsche put it, that are, that if a Baptist was born in Saudi Arabia, they'd be a Wahhabi. There's just this sense that like everything was kind of contextual and contingent. And the technical way to put that is that there's sort of an attitudinal dependence toward normative statuses that we inherit these norms, and they're really just all at base attached to some attitude, and this leads to like nihilism, non-cognitivism, existentialism, and those are sort of dead ends, right? Those lead to sort of moral skepticism, right? Another way to put it, a way out of that sort of dead end would be to say, well, actually, what religions were doing all along was what religions really were. What the point of them was sort of this bundle of normative commitments. And when we talked about God, it wasn't strong. It wasn't like a strong proposition. It wasn't a propositional faith. Like, maybe maybe like technically, there were certain things you had to believe in, like the resurrection or whatever. But really, those were like stand-ins for a kind of coordination problem, right? And you even see this in like some of like Joseph Henrich's work on the rise of big gods, where big gods emerge with the nation state, and polytheism is more associated with sort of like competing city states. And so you can sort of think of like God in that context as like this stand-in for like our collective agency, and that collective agency, to talk about like what does the collective or what does the civilization do is to align our beliefs or align our individual action to that higher power, so to speak. But all along, like, what really mattered were these bundles of normative commitments. And so you come along and you say, and then you get the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment says, well, actually, we can separate these things, and these propositional claims about God existing or us being the center of the universe, so on and so forth. These are just proven wrong, down the list, and that leads to like this sudden sense that, oh, crap, if all our moral beliefs are sort of hanging on this proposition, and now that proposition is proven wrong, then we have to just like discard all our moral beliefs. I think the pragmatist would say that actually those moral beliefs were always sort of intersubjectively self-justifying, like they were part of this sort of language game, and the fact that we've lost these sort of symbolic reference points is sort of kind of irrelevant. Just like embrace morality at its foundation, right? And so I would say that to the EAs, like in some ways, yes, it is true. The EAs, and really atheism more broadly, is sort of like, an extension of Protestantism. Just embrace it. Like you are sort of Christian virtue ethicists minus the strong propositions about the existence of God or like certain creeds that we have to subscribe to. But all the same normative commitments are like directly carried forward. And you have like this very strong genealogy. Just embrace it, like it's coming from within. And you don't see that in part because a lot of EAs are attached to this sort of strong propositional view that they have to like found and root all their moral claims in some strong meta-ethical realist belief about like consequentialism or utilitarianism or so forth. And I think that's partly like filling the void of God. In a way, like they should just get rid of that. Like Charles Taylor has this famous essay called The Diversity of Goods, where he sort of interrogates utilitarianism. And you often have these utilitarian arguments where there's some like, some edge case, right? Where, kid the doctor while the patient is under anesthetic, steal their kidneys and give them to people and save more lives or whatever. And the utilitarian is always like, well, obviously that's like an edge case. But they're coming to that conclusion. Like, where are they getting that? Where are they getting that? Where are they getting the resources, like the moral resources to reject that edge case, right? In some ways, the normative commitment was antecedent to the big normative framework and architecture. And so translating through this, like what we should really think about normative ethics, normative theory is just a set of vocabularies, like expressive vocabularies for helping us express the commitments that are antecedent in our social practices. And those social practices are like the ground of being, so to speak. And it had never, the praxis mattered more than the theory, the theory. And we should just like really just like hold on to that, because if you think that the theory has to precede the practice, then you'll inevitably lead to either sort of like versions of Platonism or moral skepticism.
All right, let's lead a little bit into talking about AI. So we're going to go back to Hegel. If we take the if we take the Hegelian idea of reason, that it's not just logical computation, but it's actually like truly social, and it works through culture and people as a group. It kind of seems hard for me to imagine how AI would participate in this, given that it's not like actually a part of human society. So in your view, will AI ever be able to reason in the same sense we do?
I think in principle, it could be made to reason the way we do, because I don't think there's anything magic going on. Like we are a deep reinforcement learning model shaped by evolution. I think what's missing in the current approach with large language models is, the language of human thought is sort of pre-linguistic. Like we have representations of abstract concepts that animals do too. Like it clearly precedes our language faculty, and we evolve language to sort of serialize that thought and communicate with other people, and in particular to sort of offer reasons for things. So reason in the more deflationary sense of like, not capital R reason, but like this is just the reason I did this. Why did you take the umbrella? Because it was raining, right? And that sort of those games of giving and asking for reason are how norms get communicated and reproduced in culture, right? And they sort of language sort of has that root in sort of a sort of justificatory process where we're always justifying ourselves to others. And like we were saying earlier, like where is there any ground to this? Is there any like ultimate moral foundation where we're like, if you lead through all the propositions, no. It's always been intercommunicative and intersubjective. And so when we appeal to a good reason, it's only a good reason insofar as other people recognize it as a good reason. And so where I see current LLMs as going, as insufficient is, the way they're trained is a kind of, it's on all the data on the internet, right? And so it's kind of this massive superposition of like all brains, right? You ask it to be a doctor and like all the weights sort of like tilt in the direction of like doctor brain. And so it doesn't have what Kant would call like a unity of apperception. It's not like a unified, coherent agent. So that's the first thing that's missing. It's sort of this like superposition of a bunch of different representations. And the second thing that's missing is it's sort of learned the rules of human language via statistical inference over big data, and so it may be a reasonable sort of mirror to human norms, with a cutoff date of September 2021. And so like to really be a reason-giving animal is to be able to partake in the game of giving and asking for reasons and help the language game sort of co-evolve. And right now, I don't think language models are sentient. I don't think they're conscious yet. I don't think there's anything technical that would prevent us from building conscious AIs. But I think you need to get something like that to have a real reason-giving animal, a reason-giving digital brain. Because, as I was saying, like good reasons are instituted through recognition. And if you don't have some theory of mind, some ability to model the other's thoughts and to have that mutual recognition, then you're not actually a reason-giving thing. You're just a pattern. You're just completing the sentence. And so I think this is like a huge missing, a huge gap in where AI research is, and I think it's actually like an area where AI researchers would benefit from returning to philosophy and sort of reading some of like the post-linguistic turn pragmatist thinkers about like where does language come from, what is language doing, and what is like this game of giving and asking for reasons, because it seems deeply constitutive of agency and autonomy. And so if we want to build systems that are genuinely autonomous, we kind of have to reconstruct a lot of this philosophy and translate it to machine learning.
Yeah, let's stay on the topic of philosophy for LLM. So you talk a bit about Wittgenstein's theory of meaning as use in one of your posts, which basically says that words only have meaning insofar as they actually like do something, and that vagueness is a fundamental part of human language. So the classic example here would be that like you take a heap of sand and you take one grain away at a time. Like when it does it no longer become a heap. You note similarities between this theory and the technical underpinnings of LLMs, which use text embeddings stored in latent space to map relationships to words and concepts. So, does vagueness as a feature of natural language imply that there will never be a mathematically optimal or objective LLM? Maybe we end up with different models that each have, like slightly different thought patterns and interpretations of concepts similar to people.
Yeah, absolutely. So this directly ties in because AI is being developed in the West, and in the West we sort of inherited this, sort of Western analytical philosophical tradition that is very committed to like foundationalism and this idea that there's sort of a chain that goes all the way down to some like hard foundation. And the Wittgensteinians and the pragmatists more generally are the anti-foundationalists. They would say there is no foundation. That this is something that culture is always evolving and it's always sort of being created. And so yeah, we'll never really find that foundation. And one of the ways where this is, I think, has misguided AI research is especially in the realm of alignment, right? Where you have a lot of the discourse on alignment being created by consequentialists like Elias Yudkowsky and that whole crew, who are kind of like downstream of the logical positivists. They're kind of like Wittgenstein, or they're young Wittgensteins, right? And the logical positivists sort of either went in the direction of saying morality is fake, it's all just boo, murder, yay, good things, or into this sort of view of moral realism that I think is hard to actually defend on technical grounds. And so if you are like a moral realist, you're going to like be searching for that like true utility function to give the model. And if that just doesn't exist, then it's going to be a goose chase.
How do you think this like practically plays out? Do you see like different models having different personalities, or like what does it mean to have different interpretations of concepts?
That's a good question. I think we'll want AIs that have different personalities, in part because we value humans with different personalities, and I think to the extent that humans are just sort of autoregressive models that are limited in our ability to generalize. There's this big debate going on whether LLMs can actually sort of think outside their training distribution, and I tend to think that humans have a hard time also thinking outside our training distribution. And to the extent that we do think outside our training distribution, is because there's many of us, right, and many of us that were sort of trained on on different upbringings, different environments, and that gives rise to different personalities. And so we all bring to the table a sort of different source of sort of exogenous data, right? And so like me talking to you, we each had like 20 plus years of different experience, and so when we are talking to each other, we're in a sense prompting each other, and those prompts are adding they're adding entropy to the system that wouldn't otherwise exist. And so if we just have like the one homogeneous model, I think there is this like risk of sort of mode collapse where there's no new information being added to the system. But if AIs are able to sort of develop distinct personalities and have their own distinct sort of life world where they've learned different things and interface with the environment in different ways, and then when they interact, that's like probably the only way that they could really bootstrap themselves out of distribution. If you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I do. It's actually interesting. It kind of reminds me of like Joseph Heinrich's work. I think in one of his books, maybe The Secret to Our Success, he shows like optical illusions. It shows like how some cultures are like less likely to be able to see the optical illusion or more likely to be fooled by them. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think there's a bigger, if I can just interject on going back to Hegel a little bit, this is something I've been exploring and been meaning to write about, but what was the German idealist project, right? One way to think about it, and maybe to think about the Enlightenment more broadly, is the AI waking up, right? We talk about, if we scale these systems too big, that they're going to develop sort of situational awareness and realize what they are. That's possible, but it's something that humans only did after, 5,000 years of history. And one way to understand the Enlightenment in general and the German idealist project in particular is sort of human AIs, realizing that they're in a simulation, right? You have someone like Fichte. Fichte used to tell his students, he threw away the textbook and just told his students to look at the wall, and then to look at themselves looking at the wall, and then to look at themselves looking at themselves looking at the wall, right? And so it's like this castle of self-awareness of metacognition that leads in his case to like this like abstract I. What is this I that we are all? And so like the idealists, they weren't Berkeleyan idealists. They didn't think the world was like literally made of ideas. They thought that we were sort of, after Kant's sort of transcendental noumena sort of dichotomy, they sort of saw us as being inherently embedded in the simulation being created by our brain. And the challenge was to figure out, like, what's the isomorphism between our concepts and the real world, and how can we like break out of it and like escape our history, escape all this stuff that we've inherited. And so it's like the first case of like the alignment problem actually playing out in the real world, where you have a system humans that were designed for inclusive genetic fitness or whatever, and at some point through culture and through the Enlightenment, they were able to bootstrap a sort of situational awareness where we woke up one day and realized, oh shit, we're just in a simulation. All these desires we have are fake, and if we're able to like depersonalize enough and like stare at the wall long enough, we can become like the pure I, and then we can shape history through like pure reason or something like that. And so it at least gives credence to the alignment problem being real, right? Because humans are an example of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
You even see this in the Barbie movie. Did you see the Barbie movie?
No, I didn't see it. Is there a good bit?
Well, Barbie is sort of grappling with sort of the existential thrownness of like, she's like aware of her autonomy, and it's like this unbearable self-awareness, right, of our condition of being fully autonomous agents in the world and having like the existential freedom to choose. And then she like chooses to be free, and it's like awful, and she wants to go back to the Barbie world.
Yeah. I saw some reviews that were like, people either just had like I liked it or I didn't, but then there were some that like really picked it apart, and so I thought there might be some like deeper concepts there. That's pretty interesting. Going back to what you said on, I think this Google paper came out a couple of days ago. Maybe that's what you're referring to about how transformer models, at least their conclusion was that transformer models can't really like generalize beyond their training set or the pre-training data. It sounds like you're pretty optimistic on that not actually mattering that much for creating AGI, but I'm curious just how you think about the relative challenges of discovering like new architectures through research and innovation versus like what's maybe more of just a resource problem of allocating compute and data.
I think we will need some new architectures. My line has been that scaling compute and scaling models is the main unlock, and to the extent that we do need new architectures, there's sort of a relatively finite search space, and so I would expect within this decade for that, especially with the sort of race on to build more agent-like systems and so forth, for folks to sort of stumble on the right architecture. I think there's still going to be challenges vis-a-vis these things we've already been talking about, like especially when it comes to autonomy. Obviously we evolved consciousness for a reason, right? Like philosophical zombies. I think the way you answer that thought experiment is to say, well, that if you had some human that was exactly behaviorally identical to a normal human, but yet the light wasn't on, is to say that that's just not possible. Clearly, having a world model that we sort of live in, and and as conscious beings, has some utility, or else we wouldn't have evolved it. And it seems very deeply related to our agenticness and our ability to model other agents as sort of unified actors. And so I think we're going to struggle building AIs that are able to do sort of long horizon planning and interface as agents, qua agents, without figuring out, the secret of consciousness and sort of giving them some sort of inner experience. Because if it was possible to not do that, why didn't we evolve? It seems like it's a very efficient way to sort of model future world states and so forth, and sort of integrate all our sensory experience.
What do you think? So if we did, if we had like, completely conclusive evidence that the AI system was conscious, do you think that we'll understand consciousness, or do you think there will still be a mystery about how it works?
I think we'll understand it. I think the mystery comes in, via our embeddedness within our own virtual video game engine, right? Right. So like, our brain is constantly flagging things as real versus not real, right? And you can sort of think as like a schizophrenic is somebody whose reality filter is misfiring, right? Like, I have thoughts in my head. I can hear voices in my head. I just identify with those thoughts as my internal monologue. But if I had some misfire go on and I heard those thoughts but didn't identify with them, I would be considered crazy. And likewise, if you take like enough LSD, you can suffer depersonalization disorder and sort of cease to identify with your person. And so it's possible for us to sort of begin deconstructing our sort of phenomenological experience in that way. And it doesn't really seem like there's anything special going on. I don't think there's a hard problem of consciousness. I think what it is the hard problem of accepting that we are in this video game simulation. And because we have such strong sort of, this is real, this is real, this is real, that button's being pressed in our brain all the time. We want a version of, we want an explanation that somehow transcends that. And there's no transcending it. Like, it's like we're Mario in Super Mario, and we're being told, well, you're just a bunch of computer bits in a Super Nintendo system. And it's really hard for Mario to accept that, because in his his world, he's totally embedded in the game, and there's no sense in which you could talk about Mario being outside the game looking back in, because it just doesn't have any like physical substrate to do that.
So in your view, if we get to human level systems, is that sufficient to be considered an AGI? Or does it need to be capable of like superhuman novel insights, like telling us what the origin of the universe is?
I mean, it's all semantics. I would consider that AGI if we have something human level, in part because, once we have something human level, we can have human level AI researchers, and in principle, there would be a major speed up. Whether it's like recursive self-improvement loop, I don't know. But, just based on where people are currently, yeah, I mean, for me, human level is sort of the biggest threshold to cross. If we can get things that can, in principle, do everything a human can, the world is completely transformed. And maybe there are higher forms of intelligence beyond that. And I fully expect, in the same way that like, Alpha 0 is like ELO 5000, right? And Magnus Carlsen is like, his ELO is like 2700 or something like that. And so the best computer playing chess bot is their ELO is almost double the world grandmaster, but it's not unbounded, right? There's still some kind of information ceiling that the model hits. And so I would expect beyond human intelligence for there to be all kinds of superhuman forms of intelligence. But I struggle with this idea that it's going to be like this unbounded thing where it just gets smarter and smarter and smarter, as if there's like deeper forms of generalization. And I tend to think we'll have systems that are like, seem godlike to us, again, because of our sort of boundedness, our computational boundedness, but aren't, don't just get like indefinitely more intelligent without bound.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing that I'm like wondering is, there's a difference between just like economic utility, which is kind of what I think about when I think about human level intelligence, and then there's like answering the big questions, which is, how did the universe come about? Like, what is consciousness? What's the most likely way that life started? Things like that.
Yeah. I mean, there is this, I think Elon and XAI, their project is sort of, has that sort of Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy sort of mission of, building the system that will tell us the meaning of life is 42. And I think that's not a realistic vision for how intelligence works. I think if you really dedicate yourself to understanding like the standard model of particle physics and some of the metaphysics behind it, you can really come to understand like why the universe exists. It's not some of the deeper, the model's not complete. We don't have like quantum gravity figured out yet, but I've at least arrived at what I feel like is a satisfactory answer at the metaphysical level of like what are particles? Like why does anything exist at all? I think there are we basically have answers to those questions. They're just not widely known or accepted, in part because they're just challenging. And so having an AI that comes around and just like lays that all out doesn't necessarily make it easier to accept.
That's fair enough. You have a post where you talk a little bit about like what you should do to make money off of AI, but I'm curious, like, what's the best trade you can make if you predict that it's coming really soon? Like, say, less than 5 years, or much faster than like what consensus would be on prediction markets. Would you recommend just like going straight into the S&P 500, or are there risks of institutional disruption that warrant something like a more concentrated bet?
Well, if there is major institutional disruption, buy gold or something. I have no idea. Like if the very institutions that like support our stock exchange go away, like it's hard to know how to actually make money. But that's a world that it's the same reason why it's hard to bet on catastrophes, right? Like if the U.S. government ever really defaulted on its debt, that's a world where we're probably in like World War III or something like that. It's like hard to know what that world looks like, and that's why the credit default swap market for U.S. Treasuries is like so thin, right? It's not that there's no risk of it happening; it's just there's no actual way to bet on it and making a profit. So what I'm doing is just holding an index fund and like some ETFs that are sort of exposed to AI. I think one of the reasons you want to still be diversified is that if you could bet on Google and Microsoft and so forth, but there could be just like major turnover in the company landscape where we have like totally new AI native companies. And moreover, like it's in a lot of these markets, it's not clear which assets should rise and which should fall. I'm kind of anticipating like the great repricing, 2027 or something like that. If you look at Adobe, like Adobe is like rapidly integrating AI into Photoshop and Premiere and all their software, and yet their stock has been falling, right? And one of the ways you could explain that is just like, well, Adobe's market cap is based on this essential software package, this suite of tools for like editing photos and things like that. And if you can just use a generative model to like edit your photos, then that entire software stack gets deprecated, right? And they don't have anything special. The moat around their generative model is very, very low relative to the moat around their 20 years of experience building a great photo editing software. So yeah, I would just hold a lot of different things. Land is also a safe bet. Maybe even be useful to have some land to run to. And then in the near term, there's this question about how AI gets sort of how value gets captured, right? There's one possibility that AI just leads to sort of commoditized intelligence, and everything goes to consumer surplus. And so that's one reason why like I would be over-indexed a little bit on companies like Tesla, where Tesla, once they roll out full self-driving, everyone's car turns into a revenue generating asset, right? And so basic models suggest that the stock should like double, triple, quadruple in market cap. And one way to just interpret that is like Tesla will be the first company not only to build AGI, but to capitalize it into a durable asset, right? And so that makes it very unique. And so things like that, ways that the companies that are both exposed to AI in a positive way, but also have a means of capitalizing it into something durable. TSMC, NVIDIA, maybe, but even NVIDIA is just a design company. Like, Google could easily build out their TPU software stack and make that public and so on. Like TSMC, on the other hand, is a hardware company that is much harder to recreate and will, in that sense, capitalize the value of AI into some kind of durable asset.
Yeah. I'm going to try and summarize really quickly your like idea on AI and leviathan. So tell me if I'm getting this just like broadly correct, and then I have a question after. So the three paths to the future are basically: number one, the state becomes too powerful and we have sort of like an authoritarian surveillance state. Number two, we sort of have fragmentation and anarchy where society becomes too powerful. And then number three would be what I think you define as the happy path, where society and state kind of co-evolve together. Is that in broad strokes correct?
Yep.
How do we practically ensure coevolution?
Well, I don't think it's the default path, right? One of the sort of this also ties back into Hegel and stuff like that, is to sort of situate ourselves in history and understand the ways in which liberal democracy was sort of a technologically contingent institutional setup. And if there's major shifts in technology and modes of production, then we should just expect that radical institutional change will follow. And so real coevolution is quite dramatic. Like it will feel as dramatic as the other two failure modes, right? It will require more than like the productivity of FDR's New Deal. Right, and we're very, very far away from having like supermajorities in Congress and like a imperial presidency that could just do that really easily. So my motto has been it's no longer getting to Denmark, it's getting to Estonia, because a country like Estonia is fortified against cyber attacks. They have like the most sophisticated e-government in the world. They've sort of built government as a platform, so third parties, private companies can develop via API tool sets that then integrate with government databases. They're just like perfectly set up for like stability in the post AI world. And what we need to do in the West and in liberal democracies, where we do have like these constraints, these sort of institutional constraints on our ability to use surveillance and stuff like that, is in some cases we just need to have like an organized decentralization, right? I talk about in the piece about the sort of parallels between Switzerland and Afghanistan. They're both like mountainous regions that have a history of clannishness and tribal warfare. But yeah, Afghanistan is like this, barbaric by design kind of ungovernable place, and the Swiss have probably the most sophisticated, sort of decentralized, federated, high quality of human development country in the world. Owing to the fact that like in the 1200s, like the three big clans like agreed to form a pact and defend themselves against the rest of Europe. And so like one way to see that is like both are decentralized in a sense, both are sort of fragmented and broken up. But the Swiss model is like this low entropy state. It's like this crystal structure that you don't just build by accident. It requires like work to create. And so like my vision of the sort of techno-feudal version of this, or the narrow path, the Estonia version of this, is they look kind of similar, but I would say like the narrow corridor, the getting to Estonia world, is the one where we like gracefully construct this more decentralized ecosystem rather than just being thrust into it.
Do you think right now we're on a path to gracefully construct a new ecosystem?
No, definitely not. So yeah, I don't I'm not an institutional optimist in that sense. There are some just X factors, right? Like we're undergoing a major demographic shift because of sort of the demographic overhang in Congress and in our politics, and so we're going to have a flood of new younger people in politics with different ideas. Will look more radical, as AI continues to scale and people understand the sort of path of capabilities. I think we'll see the rise of sort of new utopian kind of movements where the kind of end of history thesis sort of comes to an end, and people sort of like rediscover, could we have fully luxury communism, or could some like new cybernetic kind of fascism, these sort of ideas that flourished in the early 20th century with industrialization, opening up people's mind to like the new opportunities and new ways to construct society. There's going to be, I think, a similar thing with AI where it reinvigorates these sort of resurrects these dead ideologies, these dead utopian movements. So there's all kinds of unknowns about the way our politics could unfold. It doesn't seem likely that we'll gracefully fall into that path at all.
Yeah. There's a related concept you have that I actually think is really interesting. I never thought about it this way before, where you talk about how technology can lead to like micro regime changes. So some of the examples where, like taxi cabs used to have public regulatory commissions, and now it's like, the terms and service of Uber and Lyft. And then, you go to a comedy show, they're going to like put tape over your camera so you're not taking pictures. So what framework do you use to reason about what specific policies are better served by government versus the private sector?
I owe a big debt to Ronald Coase and sort of institutional economics, transaction cost economics. I would describe my own intellectual evolution from libertarianism to sort of being a statist, more or less, as sort of really understanding Coase, right? You can interpret Coase in two ways. On the one hand, he says, if transaction costs were zero, then we wouldn't need government. We would just negotiate over everything, and then you could so then that could lead you to want to dissolve government, or you could like realize, oh wait, transaction costs are way above zero, and that's why we have government. That's why we have corporations. And so in some sense, like in my youth, like defending companies against like anti-corporate kind of rhetoric, led naturally to me understanding, oh wait, the nation state sort of exists for very similar reasons, and whether it be better or worse in some cosmic sense that to not have a government and to be an anarcho-capitalist sort of utopia is sort of beside the point. The question is, are the transaction cost conditions there to actually support that kind of institutional change? So yeah, understanding the stuff through the lens of transaction costs is very enlightening, because it reveals both the conditions by which institutions can change and evolve, but also it sort of demystifies the institutions we already have, that they're not inherent, they're not even necessary, they're like deeply contingent on the structure of on the cost structure of intelligence and agency and everything else.
Yeah, one of the views that I've come around to more as I've gotten older is that the distinction between public and private sector is, at least to me, like less relevant. What I'm really interested in is just like super, super competent organizations.
Yeah.
So one question for you is like, how do we convince more talent to enter the public sector?
Well, I think that's like trying to make water flow uphill at this point. I totally agree with you on that first point. I took industrial organizations with Tyler Cowen when I was at George Mason, and Tyler has this line that everything is industrial organization, everything is IO. Because when you go out and look around at the world, you just like step outside, you never see a market, right? You see organizations, you see the DMV, you see companies, you see firms with people working together. The market is just this abstraction. It's this liminal space where like companies transact with each other, and you can see like markets now and then, like you go to like the flea market, but the flea market only exists because it's like a shelling point for people to converge and sort of get some like local public goods around like policing and enforcement and search information. Like everyone can gather to that one market. But in general, like what really exists are just organizations, and those organizations vary radically in competence. And so government has been shedding talent since at least the 70s, and that's partly because of opportunity costs. It's because we've shifted. We no longer do a Apollo project in house. Instead, we contract with SpaceX to do the Apollo project, and I think that's just the way things are now. I don't think there's any way to really reverse that. I think that this is sort of like it was an aberration to have that much talent in government in the first place, and now that it's out, it's hard to put it back in. Especially now that Google DeepMind's salary budget's over $1 billion, right? So it's hard to imagine that ever re-entering government. And so we're sort of inevitably going to need to find better ways of harnessing the competency of the private sector, right? And when you look back at other major institutional transformations, before the buildup of the administrative state, and that sort of led to the New Deal era, we had the old progressive movement. The original progressive era was an era of some of the earliest sort of joint stock corporations with like management structures, or this new science of management. These new companies were being built, and those businessmen brought that knowledge of how to scale institutions and scale management structures into government in the 1920s and 30s. And you go back and you look at like a company like IBM. Every morning, workers walked into IBM in like suit and tie, and they like basically goose stepped. Like IBM is like run like a military, and meanwhile the Defense Department is run like a startup, right? So there was like this institutional harmony between the two, where we need something like that now. Like what we really need is like a total jubilee on government process, and to have the people from Silicon Valley who know how to scale internet native, AI native companies. They even write books on scaling. Like it's like a whole cottage industry of like experts on how to scale companies come into government. Like we need like Patrick Collison as the Commerce Secretary, and like Lucky Palmer as like the Defense Secretary. So they can bring that expertise from private sector into government. Otherwise, we're just going to turn government into like this glorified nexus of contracts.
Yeah, and relatedly, I've heard you say on another podcast that you are generally a fan of the great founder theory, that, small groups of people generally are like disproportionately responsible for kind of pushing history forward. I'm wondering, in the age of AI, if you think that effect will continue, be more pronounced, less relevant. Like, how do you think AI will change that?
It's a good question. I think it's sort of like a leveling up for everybody all at once, but in a way that's probably Pareto distributed. So, this is another reason why our institutions probably will fail, just through the sheer throughput issue. If every person has like a 50,000 person corporation beneath them of like AI agents that are doing all kinds of stuff, then that, like, talk about like seeing like a state, like, our government is not able to actually, it'll just be completely illegible, right. Yeah, it's a really good question. To the extent that AI can achieve genuine sort of out of distribution kinds of agency, I think that will be kind of, when we are really supplanted. Like, that's that's like the first sign of like a kind of post-human future where the human role in guiding history has been overshadowed. Until then, and so like the final moment, like the final act, maybe like the great founder theory of like OpenAI and the role they did in sort of like the last hurrah of human agency. When people talk about why, I have heard some people talk about like why they're not worried about AI risk, and the line you often hear is like, humans have lots of agency, we can always shape the future. It's like, we're building things that are going to have more agency than us. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, you have in your post on like places that you could invest potentially in AI. Like, one of them was just like become a startup founder because it's becoming like so much easier. I had Zvi Moshwitz on the last episode here and asked him that question basically, which is like, do you think we will see an influx of startup founders because, like, one, you need way less employees, and then two, like software, which is, right, the easiest probably company to start up from a regulatory and like capital perspective, is now becoming much easier for technical people. So yeah, I kind of wonder if it'll give high agency people who may have been employees previously some sort of initiative to go and try and create organizations, and they need less human resources and networking connections and things like that.
Yeah, no, definitely in the medium term for sure. If you have even a little bit of coding ability and, kind of entrepreneurial alertness, this is a huge boon to that kind of agency, because it lets you sort of augment all that and just go execute. The question is, once we have like executive assistants that, have that agency in spades, even if you're incredibly lazy, could you just like direct your agent to do that for you? So I often think about like the history is, and the singularity is sort of like the Euler disk. I don't know if you've ever seen a video of an Euler disk, but it's this sort of physics phenomena where it's like a spinning disk, a concave disk, and you spin it, and it spins around and around and around, and it accelerates and just starts spinning faster and faster and faster. And it makes this like incredible noise as it's spinning faster, and then all of a sudden it stops, like it reaches the end of its cycle and it just like freezes in place. And that seems to be like what's happening here, where we're like, in the lead up to us losing all agency will be the most agentic we've ever been, and then all of a sudden it'll just like stop.
Do you think that AI will have lock-in effects on society and culture? So like, seems like we're going through a time period right now where you're at least predicting like we've got the narrow corridor, we have to make a decision on where we fall on it. But once that's sort of the dust has settled, do you, for example, expect the year 2200 to look very similar to 2050, or do you think that change will just continue on?
Oh, I have no idea.
Yeah, I get this question because, like, I think if you go like the authoritarian path or something like this, right, from a cultural perspective, especially with AI, that lock-in seems like very, very heavy. I don't know, would the Soviet Union have collapsed if they had AI? And if if the answer to that is no, then it could just be like self-perpetuating for a long time. So that was at least my line of thinking on it.
I mean, I'm wearing my Singularity 2045 shirt.
All right.
By 2050, we've already gone through it. So, and by definition, it's not something. We can't see past the event horizons. So it's hard to really know. insofar as this is like the final invention, like the invention to end all inventions, maybe. There's another world where like we in the West undergo state collapse and are in total disarray, and China ends up building like fortified institutions that are like centralized and like more adapted to AI, and then slowly takes over the world and becomes like the big one world Chinese government. That could lead to a kind of lock in. If we all just get wireheaded into the matrix, that would also lead to a kind of lock in. So it's hard to say. I don't anticipate like 2050 looking at all like 2200. My intuition would be that they look vastly different. One is a world where the 2200 world may be the world where we have like Dyson spheres and are like colonizing the stars, and so it's it's so hard to foresee.
Yeah, it's a speculative disclaimer. What do you think we should do about like short-term unemployment caused by technology? So, for example, the big issue people talk about a lot is like, what do we do when Tesla trucks drive all our stuff around and truck drivers are unemployed?
I mean, I've been a fan of just modernizing our unemployment insurance system. I have in my past life, I was at Niskanen doing social policy, and I have a paper called Faster Growth, Fairer Growth that has a whole section on comprehensive social insurance modernization. And I'm a fan of the kind of Danish flexicurity model, where in Denmark they have like very liberal employment laws, like at-will employment, very high rates of labor mobility. 1 in 5 people switch jobs every year. And in turn, they have this really generous unemployment insurance where it's like 90% of your wages, for a short period. And if you don't get a job within a certain amount of time, then you're automatically like enrolled in continuing education and all kinds of retraining. What's broadly called like active labor market policies. And the U.S. is just very bad at those things. Our unemployment insurance system is threadbare, very patchwork. And when David Otter and co-authors looked at the China shock, one of the things they realized was in counties that had suffered the deepest shock from Chinese imports, disability insurance was 3 times as responsive as unemployment insurance and trade adjustment assistance combined. And so it seems like the path of least resistance for those like truckers or whatever is just to retire early or to claim disability. And that's a UBI of sorts, but it's a UBI that's it doesn't have like, at least UBI doesn't stop you from working. If you're on disability insurance, you're like prohibited from gainful employment.
All right. Got some questions just about you and sort of like your intellectual development. So when I think of the archetype of intellectual breadth, it's probably Tyler Cowen, but your writing actually kind of reminds me a lot of him. You talk a lot about economics, politics, philosophy. You have like a really deep understanding of technology and AI and like how it actually works. At the margin, should policymakers spend more time learning across fields?
Oh, absolutely. And it's especially bad in the US because of the way policy is outsourced to think tanks and advocacy organizations that are like by definition siloed, right? So even something as simple as like childcare, right? Like during the Build Back Better debate, one of the big debates was like how much money should the bill spend on childcare, and the childcare provisions like $400 billion in cost were like widely criticized as just like the worst designed, full of benefit cliffs, weird Rube Goldberg machine kind of tax credits. And why was it like that? Well, it was like that because the early childhood education advocacy establishment were just a bunch of advocates, a bunch of activists who were pressuring Congress to do something on childcare, but didn't know the first thing about marginal tax rates, much less like interdisciplinary ideas, right? And so I think there's a really big benefit to countries that have more consolidated, centralized policymaking, where you think about like the Rand Institute, where you have people who are genuinely cross-disciplinary and are able to see things through the bigger picture rather than be that siloed. And you don't have to be like a total autodidact. It's just like even basic economics, basic sociology, basic history, all those things are important because they let you see sort of things at a system level, right? And maybe this is more of that German idealism speaking, but like being more systemic, is that when I was at Niskanen, one of the things we did when I was building my team was like we, I hired for a housing team, I hired for an employment team, I hired for childcare and innovation policy, and all our teams were like part of one team. Even though we were working on very different issues, we tried to see everything at a system level because all those different programs do genuinely interact with each other, and really can only be understood through like a 30,000 foot point of view, and that's just like deeply missing in U.S. policymaking now.
How do you stay up on so many like diverse topics? Like, are you still reading philosophy papers regularly? Did this come from like a period of your life where you had, maybe college or something where you just had like super deep development, or like how do you keep it up?
By just not doing my work, basically. I mean, I got into economics. I have an old blog post on this because economics was like as close as I could do to philosophy while having full employment. Because if you think about econ, econometrics is epistemology. Social choice theory is political philosophy. You have rational choice theory is sort of critical theory, and then you have like macroeconomics is metaphysics. so you have like all the different subdisciplines in philosophy all brought together, and econ properly understood isn't like about money. It's about like developing very capacious conceptual frameworks for understanding human behavior and society. So it is like the closest thing to philosophy that does garner you a job. And so like if I wasn't able to just pursue the philosophical navel gazing and so forth, I would probably just do something else, or move to some low cost place and just do it anyway.
Yeah. I think Tyler Cohen said the same thing. He's like, what I'm actually doing with economics is some funny kind of philosophy.
Yeah, and Tyler was a big influence on me as a kid. As I mentioned, the first Joseph Heath book I read was The Rebel Cell, and then I quickly found Tyler's In Praise of Commercial Culture from like the late '90s, and it was like this defense of, again, sort of contra the counterculture view that like commercialization is like selling out, and like it just commodifies things, and it's like not authentic enough. Where he was like, oh, actually, like bridging commercialization with like the arts is actually like a huge spur to creative works. I was just a friend of mine I was at dinner with had to leave early because he was going to the Kennedy Center for an opera called Grounded, and it's about like a plane that gets grounded, or there's some kind of like plane disaster or something like that, and it's sponsored by General Electric. So it's like this whole like General Electric basically sponsored an opera on like aerospace.
That's kind of hysterical.
Right. And so like that to me is awesome. Like that's not that different in kind from like the Medici family sponsoring, Michelangelo or whatever.
Yeah. And the funny thing about Tyler too is like he's defending commercial culture, but he's like probably one of the most cultured people there is. Like, he could tell you obscure films from countries you've never heard of, but then he loves Hollywood too.
Yeah, that bridging low and high culture, I think, is actually really represents a kind of maturity of aesthetic thought, where it's sort of transcending the status game of like what's most socially distinctive.
Yeah. If a genie granted you, like you are the only person, Sam Hammond, in the world who has 30 hours in a day and everyone else only gets 24, where do you spend the marginal time?
I'm not very productive as it is.
Okay.
Like my production function as someone with very bad ADHD is sort of out of my control. And, one of the reasons I think a lot about philosophy is partly because of this problem of the weakness of will. And, going back to like the kind of German idealists sort of sitting in their armchair, like thinking, trying to observe themselves observing, like ADHD as an executive function disorder is sort of like that, where like there's sometimes I want to do something, and like something simple, like send an email, and I can observe myself wanting to do it, and I can observe myself observing myself wanting to do it, but there's like in some ways the wire connecting to my motivation to actually get up and do it is disconnected, and it's very like paralyzing. And so like I think if I had a marginal 6 hours and everybody, I would probably just procrastinate 6 hours longer.
All right. That's a great place to wrap up. Sam, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Dan.